Hey everybody, welcome to Life is Beautiful. I'm Anthony. Today, I wanted to talk about something that gets brought up fairly often when people walk into my house. See, they know that I'm a home brewer and they're used to seeing the carboys of all different colors and, all the swirling and fizzing and popping. But it seems everyone's attention always gets drawn to one carboy in particular. And they always ask me, what the hell is wrong with that beer? See, I've had a mixed culture lambic inspired ale going for a few months now, and it started to grow a gnarly little pellicle on top, and I think it's absolutely beautiful. I've always been really attracted to the way pellicles look. They can look like some odd alien landscape or toxic wasteland in a cheesy B-class sci-fi picture show. But I can see how homebrewers who have never experienced this before could be completely thrown off, worried, and confused about the giant moldy loogie that's taken over their carboy. So I thought it would be fun if today's video we took a deep dive look at exactly what is a beer pellicle, what causes it, what is it made of, is it healthy, is it good, or exactly what to do with it if one does appear. So basically a homebrew beer pellicle overview. So to start off, we need to discuss what exactly is a pellicle. A pellicle is a biofilm that forms on the surface of cooked foods, liquids, or even human teeth. It's basically a coagulation of organic compounds and extracellular material that binds together and forms a membrane over the source material. When put into the context of beer production, pellicles are an accumulation of both live and dead yeast or bacteria cells, differing protein compounds, and varying polymers from the beer's various ingredients that forms at the liquid to gas interface. They can come in huge assortments of shapes and sizes and textures based upon the level of fermentation in which the pellicle begins to form, the ingredients forming it, and the amount of carbon dioxide trapped beneath the surface. That's what causes all the cool bubbles, by the way. If the pellicle forms early and fermentation is still pretty active, it's likely that you're going to have much larger, much bigger bubbles. There can be big bubbles, slimy ropes, dry patchy valleys, spider webs, and flocky rolling bumps, and so much more. Now, when discussing what a pellicle is, I think it's equally important to discuss what a pellicle isn't. And that is mold. It is certainly not mold. People new to the hobby often get spooked and jump to conclusions that any sign of fermentation, whether it be a yeast raft or just a simple krausen, is mold. So I can only imagine what they would think if they saw a full-blown pellicle growing in their carboy. Although there has been some instances where mold has grown intertwined within the pellicle or on top of the pellicle, and here's a few examples of that. You can tell this one is mold because it kind of has somewhat of a fuzzy appearance, plus it has extreme discoloration. Usually mold appears in greens, blues, maybe sometimes yellows, and usually definitely blacks. This one is very clearly mold. You can tell by its strange formulation pattern. Yeast and pellicles don't usually form in such a ropey, stringy, worm-like situation, plus its discoloration. This one is a little bit more difficult to tell. It has somewhat of an appearance of mold going on here because of its accumulation. It's a little bit denser than the rest of what you see going throughout it, and there's a couple spots here where there is some minor discoloration. This one's a little bit harder to tell though. So now that we've talked about what a pellicle is and isn't, we need to talk about what causes a pellicle to form in the first place. Now, unfortunately, the answer is that we don't really know. See, pellicle formation hasn't really been as deeply researched in regards to beer by the scientific community as it has in other areas such as the dental or the food industry. And because of that, there's no real definitive answers. Now, that's not to say we don't have some very well-educated hypotheses and theories. So in this next section, we're going to go ahead and talk about some of the more commonplace and more well-accepted theories about what causes a pellicle to form. So before we get into the theories, let's knock out a couple of things that we absolutely know for sure. Inoculated microbes cause the pellicle formation. This includes yeast strains like Brettanomyces and Saccharomyces. And yes, Sac has been documented to form pellicles. No, it's not up for debate, so go ahead and save it, keyboard warriors. I don't want to hear it in my comment section. But it's usually a wild strain of Sac and not a commercially available brewer's yeast, so there's that. Bacteria can also form pellicles to include Acinetobacter, Pediococcus, and some Lactobacillus strains, although there hasn't been a whole lot of research done into this. And lastly, pellicles are formed when these microbes are introduced to even the smallest amounts of oxygen. But you might be asking yourself, my process is perfect. How did the oxygen get in? See, even if you purge your fermentation vessel with CO2 and all the oxygen gets blown out by the aggression of your primary fermentation, eventually that aggression is going to start slowing down and the pressure is going to start changing inside of your vessel, causing some small inflow of oxygen. It's just a simple fact of the matter. You're never going to be able to be completely void of oxygen in a homebrew setting. And that leads us to our first hypothesis. One of the most widespread rumors in the sour portion of the homebrew community is that the pellicle is formed when too much oxygen is introduced to your fermenting wort, so the microbes band together to create some sort of protective shield to prevent oxidation. The problem with this theory is that if that was the case, off flavors and unwanted byproducts of oxygen exposure would be much more prominent. Sour beers would be getting absolutely destroyed by asobacter and other aerobic enzymes which require a steady supply of oxygen, and they would be full of nasty byproducts caused by overwhelming stress on anaerobic fermenting microbes as well as their retardation. What seems to be the most commonly accepted theory within the industry is that pellicles are formed by aerobic enzymes like Brettanomyces to act as somewhat of a pressure gauge to allow small enough amounts of oxygen into the beer for their own controlled metabolization, while simultaneously restricting access to other aerobic enzymes like asobacter or mold, which grow much faster than the slow-moving Brett. Brett does this by gathering the cells together and floating to the surface to form the biofilm pellicle. The simple fact of the matter is that we honestly just don't know what causes a pellicle to form. Could it be for protection? Maybe. Could it be to harness the power of oxygen? Maybe. Could it be a little of this and a little of that? Maybe a fusion of the two? Maybe neither. Who knows? Okay, so what to do about a pellicle? You got a pellicle and you have an understanding of what it is and a rough idea about what caused it. Let's talk about what to do about it. It can really be boiled down to one of three options. Either A, you are brewing beer that was purposely introduced to a mixed culture, so pellicle formation is normal and you should just leave it alone. Regardless of why it was formed, the microbes are just doing their thing. You should just let them continue. Some people think that you need to break it up by sloshing it around, but for real, just relax, leave it alone, let it do its thing. It'll work itself out. Pellicles sometimes just fall out on their own, and even if they don't worry about it. If you're taking proper gravity readings, you'll know when the beer is finished fermenting, and you just poke your racking cane through and do what you normally do from there. Easy peasy. Your other options pertain to when you didn't purposely introduce other microbes and one forms anyway. Most likely you had some cross-contamination somewhere along the way, and you should look into your sanitization practices. But your options are B, dump it out and start over, or C, let it ride and see what happens. And lastly, it seems a lot of people freak out when they notice a pellicle forming inside of their bottle. Concerns over bottle bombs and overcarbing really give people the heebie-jeebies, so when they're dealing with microbes they don't fully understand and they notice something that's different from what they're used to, kind of weirds them out a little bit. Bottle pellicles happen, and it's nothing to be overly concerned about. For most of us, our beers will be exposed to oxygen somewhere between the carboy to bottling bucket to bottles. It shouldn't give you any real problems in the long run. It's just the microbes reacting to the small amount of oxygen that was left in the bottle after you capped it. And it doesn't mean that your bugs and your microbes are working any harder to force carb your bottle than they would in this phase anyways in a bottle without a pellicle. If you still don't feel comfortable, just add a tiny little bit less priming sugar or gently shake the bottle to make the pellicle dissipate. It's mostly an aesthetic thing. Some lambic producers also recommend you age the bottle on its side, and that helps reduce the formation of a pellicle. I'm not really sure what the science is behind that, but I mean, those people are much smarter than me, so I mean, that's one idea. Now, before we wrap this video up, I do want to talk about a few more misconceptions regarding pellicles. There's a whole lot of them. As I mentioned earlier, there isn't a whole lot of scientifically backed proof that regards to pellicles. So I think it would be interesting in this last segment to discuss some of the things that I hear more commonly passed around within the community. First off, I commonly hear that a pellicle has a direct correlation to the quality of the beer's final form. This is not true. As I've mentioned already, a pellicle is just a microbial reaction to oxygen. It in no way is going to dictate whether your beer is going to be good or bad. And that goes for the reverse effect. If you don't have a pellicle, that doesn't mean anything either. It doesn't mean that your beer still isn't going to come out just as complex, sour, and funky as it would if it did have a pellicle. Myth number 2 is that your beer is ready when the pellicle falls out. That's not true either. Pellicles can come and go several times throughout the fermentation cycle of a mixed culture ale. They'll rise and fall depending on, different microbes waking up, going into effect, and reacting to different stimuli, or maybe additional sugars were added. There's just multiple times that they can come, go, rise, fall, gather, dissipate. It's just natural. And the only real way to tell that your beer is actually finished is just the same as it would be with any other beer. It's not the pellicle. It's if you're taking proper gravity readings and you notice that the sugar level has finally reached the targeted gravity or its terminal gravity, and then you can proceed to packaging.
And lastly, this myth is one that I hear most often. People often think that they can identify what microbes are inside of a beer based solely upon the appearance of the pellicle.
Now, there's probably a ton of anecdotal evidence of adding a very particular microbe and getting a very certain looking pellicle. The thing is, that's not definitive. There are so many things that make up the pellicle, and there are so many variables that the microbes are reacting to, that it's just simply impossible to be able to say this pellicle was caused by this microbe simply off of its appearance. The only example that I can think of where a very specific microbe is at work and you can tell it's at work based off of the beer's appearance is with Pediococcus. Pediococcus can make a beer very slimy and very ropey, and if you don't know what I mean by that, here's a great example.
All the way through.
Looks like agave nectar.
Right out like jelly, like a big snot.
But that has more to do with the actual consistency of the beer and less to do with its pellicle, although there is a little interplay there. But I digress. If you still don't believe me, we're going to take a look at a couple different pictures that revolve around either single culture ferments or very specific mixed culture ferments, and you try to guess what the pellicle formation is caused by.
One of the more common things I hear in pellicle identification is if you have large bubbles, that's the sign of Brett. I can see where the logic comes from there because the bubbles are caused by carbon dioxide, as we mentioned earlier, and Brett, as it ferments, it's a yeast, so it produces all of its byproducts to include carbon dioxide, so it makes sense for the bubbles to be there. The problem is, other enzymes also make carbon dioxide to begin with. Wild sac can make both a pellicle and carbon dioxide. Some lactobacillus strains can, so it's not a guaranteed identifier. Take this pellicle for example. We got a nice pellicle, big old bubbles going on, and if you went by the other theory, you would think that it's Brett. But this was actually just Saccharomyces and lactobacillus that formed this pellicle and these bubbles. And since we're talking about Brett, let's look at this pellicle for example. This is a 100% Brett beer that doesn't have the massively large bubbles in its pellicle. It's more smoothish and more flocky looking. So these are just one of the many examples of how you can't exactly identify what enzymes are actively creating your pellicle. It's just a common misconception.
So that about wraps up the base of what exactly goes on inside of a pellicle, what causes a pellicle, what to do about a pellicle, the whole shebang. But I do hope you enjoyed this pellicle overview. It was a ton of fun to make and I learned so much. I really hope you learned something too. If there's anything you want me to try to dissect and do an overview on later on, a different topic, let me know. I'll try to do my best. But I do really appreciate everybody checking out this video and taking the time to watch it. I really appreciate it. Give it a like, comment, and a share. It really, really helps the channel on the analytics if I'm getting those things. So thank you very much. Cheers.